So good afternoon. My name is Jan Hatcher-Roberts, and I'm retired and enjoy my life teaching and hanging out with people and working with people I like now. So it's really fun. So one of the things I like is helping Neil on this conference every year, or every other year. But one thing that he did mention was the idea of maybe thinking about some recommendations. And there's a few groups here that are represented that probably have a key advocacy point that they could or would like to make within the context of this conference, or in terms of things that they've heard at this conference. So we're wondering if those groups that can do advocacy and would like to, if they might want to think about a recommendation, and we can put them together into recommendations from the conference, and then we send them to the minister responsible for development, defense, health, and they have to then respond. And now we have a more responsive government. We could expect a response. And of course, when you get a response, and that's a thought out position from the government. So sometimes it helps you move ideas forward. So in the past, in a place long and far ago, 10 years ago, this kind of process was very useful. So it's probably something we could think about again. So we ask that you think about it, and then we'll probably contact you after, but within your subgroups. So this session is on sustainable development, the Sustainable Development Goals through an equity and ethics lens. We have till 5:30. We have 3 15-minute presentations, 2 live and 1 taped, and then hope to have 15 minutes for discussion. The ethics piece isn't going to be particularly presented, but I'd like you to think about the ethical implications as we go through each of the presentations. What are some of the dilemma? What is the dilemma around ethics and equity, around making decisions in interventions, in locations, in pushing to the poorest of the poor? We're always making decisions. Some are political, some are ethical, some are evidence-based. So I'd like you to think about that, and then in some of the discussions after, I've got some questions to pose, or hopefully you'll have some questions as well. So our first speaker is Michael Clarke. And Michael is an adjunct professor in the School of Public Health at Western, Ontario. Is it called Western University now? Western University. He's worked as a senior executive within the Canadian government and has held numerous university positions over 20 years of progressive increasing responsibilities. He brings together a record of research, productivity, academic achievements, and experience in university administration and corporate management. Most recently, before he moved to London, he was with the International Development Research Centre, IDRC, and so has had a strong development and research experience, as well as a focus on policy influence. So I'd like to introduce Michael, and he's going to be talking about the equity piece and fairly controversial points, I hope. So I'll give you the 3-minute mark, okay?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jen, and thank you very much, Neil, wherever the hell you are. Where are you? Neil, thank you so much for inviting me here. I've known about PEGASUS since the first conference, and Neil was kind enough to ask me to come along to this one. As long, apparently, the condition was, as I understand it, I was not to show any slides on microbiology. Is that correct? Oh, we'll do that offline, okay? Jan mentioned my career has taken what appears to me to be a very logical course, but nobody else can understand it, and that's fine. But I want to talk to you today about, well, I was going to, originally when Neil talked to me about this, I thought I'm going to bring a real fun-filled and fact-filled kind of a thing to you, but then I ran into a problem, and I've had difficulty solving that problem, and I'm really hoping that you're going to help me solve this problem today. And the problem is around attempting to understand what we mean by equity. So I'll get there, and why that's become a problem for me and for others, I believe, as well. So first of all, the disclosure piece. I am actually on the board of directors of a small startup social enterprise called Tech for Life. I'd be happy to talk to you about that company afterwards. It's new in the last 14 months and focuses entirely on maternal and child health in the Global South. I think it's important to reveal those, to make those disclosures. I also think it's important for us to reveal and disclose our biases. That could take the entire time of my talk, but I do want to talk to you about one thing I had to do to address inherent biases. And that was a couple years ago, I guess now, it was suggested to me by my daughter that I sign a certain pledge. It was more than a suggestion, I might say. And I have very happily signed this pledge that was put out by a chap from the Center for Global Development. And it is a pledge that leads into my talk on equity, but it's meaningful. And I encourage every man in this room to sign this pledge and put your name to it. Because what was noted, what this pledge was based on, was the 2014 World Summit on Women that had this as a panel. That is outrageous. That is completely outrageous. And that prompted the pledge, and let's just do it, okay? Let's just make every man in this room sign that pledge so that we do something right for a change. So I have decided to address this talk on equity, and I very unashamedly based this on a book that I've actually not read by Harry Frankfurt. Harry's a philosopher of note, and he's written this book that I've not yet read, but I like the title of it. But Harry's written another book, actually, that I carry around with me a lot, that I'm not going to talk about, but I find myself having to consult this book very, very frequently. You don't need a Kindle, you need a pocket, right? And as I said, this is an important book that we all could consult, but we're not going to talk about it here. So, what is the problem that we're trying to deal with here? The problem came up in a couple of courses, graduate courses that I was teaching this past term, when we tried to define global health. And we had a really interesting program where half the students were from Africa, half were from Canada. And over the course of the academic year, we kept asking the students, so define for us what global health was. Well, that changed over time, and every student had a different definition, and it became truly a wicked problem in the classic sense of the word. But I don't want to focus particularly on the entire complexity of global health. I want to focus just on one aspect of that, and that is equity. And it turned out that equity was named by the expert panel on Canada's strategy for global health that the Canadian Academy launched in 2011. It turns out that that was the top issue that the Academy felt needed to be dealt with. And of all the issues around global health, equity was important. The organization that I'm proud to work with right now is the Canadian Coalition for Global Health Research. And it's gathering a perspective strategy or exercise that actually picked up the ball from where the Academy left off when it published its report. Also came to the conclusion that equity is an important part of global health. Now, many of you will have seen this illustration of what the difference is between equity and equality. And I used it in my teaching as well. And I showed this to the class in the Masters in Public Health program at Western, and to explain to them that, okay, that's equality, this is equity. Until I had a smart student from the Congo put his hand up and said, but Michael, really, if this was to be an equitable situation, we'd tear the fence down. I went, yes. I thought that is what equity is. And then I had another smart student say, there aren't any girls in that picture. So don't use this in your teaching, all right, if you're teaching this. This is not a good illustration. I've challenged my students to come up with a better one, and so we're working on it. But we had to come to some conclusion, or at least some beginning point, to talk about equity. And so I wanted to visualize it. I really am a visual data guy. I really like that kind of demonstration of data, but I couldn't come to that easily because I didn't really understand the concept. But one concept that I did understand, I thought, really well, was inequity. And so I want to start with what I see as being inequity, and then go from there. It's kind of a classic avoidance strategy, I guess. But inequity looks like this. It simply looks like a graph where a few people have much more than they need, and very many need more than they have, whatever X and Y is, okay? Whatever you want to substitute for Y, and we're going to go through this exercise of looking at different X's and Y's. So I want to, in fact, start with substituting the X variable when it comes to a distribution. But the way things look right now, they don't look very dissimilar to this if you're going to use X equals money. And so what this looks like right now is status quo. And so let's look at what it means if X equals money. We've already heard today of the announcement from Oxfam in 2015 that 62 people own as much worth have as much wealth as the bottom or the poorest 50% of the world. The only real good thing about that graph there over on the left is that according to it, by 2022, there'll be no more billionaires, as I see it there. But it could mean that there'll only be one billionaire left that owns half of the world's wealth. The point is that this is inequity. This is truly a picture of maldistribution, a lack of justice, a lack of fairness, a lack of equity. And so given the shape of the curve that we looked at, some people said, well, wouldn't an equitable curve, this is just more data showing you when this happened in 2015, that there was convergence of the wealth of the poorest 50% with those 62 individuals. And the other thought that I had over the last couple of days was that I'll bet you at least one of those 62 individuals is involved with the fiasco that we're seeing in Brazil right now. At any rate, let's move on. One of the things I did want to point out here is that in 2008, we saw a drastic reduction in the wealth of those 62 people, but a relatively untouched impact on the wealth of the poorest 50%. And some people call that resilience. I'd be very, very cautious about calling that resilience, and we can talk about that later if you wish. So there is the graph of inequity. That's what it looks like. And I asked the question, is there an optimum value of X around which we could, in fact, construct an equitable distribution? And so I asked the question, where do we put that optimum? Where do we decide where it's going to be? And that's a question we're going to get to. But what we did was to ask, okay, does a normal distribution around that optimum, does that look like equity? It looks different. We've got an even distribution around that optimum, but we still end up with some who have more than they need, and we still have some who need more than they have. And that's the part of the curve that still represents inequity. And so if we're to look at how conventional development practice starts now, it looks at a graph like this, and I'll show you the real data in a minute, and it does look like that. And conventional development practice says what we want to do, in fact, is to move people and move communities from that side of the graph to this side of the graph. And I've seen this in presentations where really this is what we're trying to do, is move people out of that the left side of the graph over to the right side of the path. And you know what happens if you continue to do that? You end up with this. And all you've really done is you've moved the goalposts. All right? You've simply changed the name of the game by changing the goalposts. And that is not what we're at. That is not the name of the game. We are not involved in moving the goalposts. We are motivated beyond simply an exercise that looks like that still ends up with inequity, because moving the goalposts is what Cameron and his cronies are doing in the UK right now, with attempting to get the UK to meet its child poverty goals simply by redefining the goals. That's not what we're talking about. Here's the real data, and this is what it looks like. It really does look like a normal distribution. But there's some, this was in the Globe and Mail, there's some profoundly egregious mistakes being made in this infographic, all right? And I'm not going to go into the details of it, but there's some real mathematical errors that are being made here, including applying the criteria for defining poverty in 2015 to data from 1900. So that's wrong. But the point I want to make here is that we know that poverty is far more than a lack of money. We know that if we look at the Oxford criteria for multidimensional poverty, we're talking about poverty in many different aspects. And one of the aspects that we are talking about here is wealth. That's where X equals the dollar right now. And if we are concerned about moving people into that other part of the graph where they are lifted out of poverty and they are now more wealthy, and they are therefore more consuming. There are people who are going to be at this conference who know far more about this than I do, but this is what came out of our discussions in the class. If consumption goes up because wealth goes up, that's probably likely. If consumption of Z goes up, and Z is a finite resource, then what happens? This is a graph that many of you will have seen. It's a graph that shows the Human Development Index plotted against the ecological footprint for countries around the world. And so what we've got is the HDI along the x-axis, and along the y-axis we have the ecological footprint. And so what we are attempting to do in this scenario, what we're attempting to do is to understand where countries are sitting on this graph. If we go above this line, we are out of the ecological sustainability of the Earth. If we go below this line, we are at a Human Development Index, which represents poverty. And if the development-wise people are telling us that what we're trying to do is to move countries from that low HDI to a high HDI, then we are in difficulty, because that process moves countries into that square, and that is an ecologically unsustainable square for any country to be in. Canada sits there. That is the sweet spot. That is where we need to be, with a high level of HDI and an ecological footprint that represents sustainability over the long term. If we are intent in a conventional development context trying to move people and countries into that sweet spot, I do not know how that can happen without that happening. And that left me with a very uncomfortable conclusion, that as we are lifting people out of poverty, as we claim to be lifting people out of poverty, we're also having to undertake a simultaneous exercise, and that is lifting people out of poverty. We have to alleviate wealth so that we end up with us. Now, that gets a little bit uncomfortable for a lot of people, but I think with others that I've heard here today, this is sort of the ideal of what it is that we're looking for. Now, how are we going to get there? The only way I could see of getting there was dressing up like that slide of people that Meb showed this morning, where we're all wearing masks and camouflage, and we are occupying and taking over the global economy. I don't know how else to do this. And I wasn't being helped at all in trying to understand this by reading Chris Hedges' book, which you should all read if you want to read a book and not fall asleep at night, read Chris's book. Now, I was really stuck at trying to solve this conundrum because it represents a drastic overhaul to the global economy. I found the answer on Wednesday, and it has the answer in what we heard this morning from the opening ceremony that welcomed us to this territory. I want you to look at this. The concept that I'm talking about is embedded in Native culture. In our Aboriginal and Native peoples in Canada, they have an understanding of what democracy is that contains this phrase that I'd never heard before called economic homogeneity. That's what we're talking about. The work has already been done. So very, very quickly, I want to leave X equals money, and I want to talk about X equals health. Now, Hans Rosling has done a great job of showing we can substitute one for the other, of course. This represents quantity of life, not necessarily quality, but life expectancy is a good indicator. This is the work of Dennis Raphael from York that has told us what makes people in Canada sick. I want to concentrate on this part of the graph because that's the part that we can actually do something about. And so we've already dealt with income. I went to the WHO definition of equity. It is the absence of avoidable or remediable differences among groups of people, whether those are defined socially, economically, demographically, or geographically. I looked at these particular terms in that definition, and I thought, I get it. It's the absence of differences, absence of avoidable or remedial differences. I get it. I understand it. I know what that means. And now, what I want to do is to apply that to health. And so I want you to follow with me here, and this is where it gets tricky. I want you to wonder and imagine if equity can be mathematically calculated. I want to ask you the question, of these curves here, which one represents a more equitable distribution of X? Think about it. In other words, I'm asking the question, can equity be measured by the standard deviation of these curves? Around that optimum. There's our optimum, right? Whatever it happens to be. In other words, do these curves represent increasing equity as the curves become narrower and taller? Is this what equity really looks like? And ultimately, as we become more and more equitable, we have to ask the question, and I've already asked this question decisively, and I know what her answer is. What would the ideal curve look like that would indicate how much inequity we are willing to tolerate amongst the social determinants of health? And it looks something like this. Now, I'm not going to steal Cicely's thunder. I know she's going to deal with it. The absence of differences. So here's the challenge to policymakers. The absence of differences means that we have to envision and estimate the optimum for each of those social determinants. Dream what the ideal looks like. Imagine what it could be. What should it be? Don't give a damn about how doable it is. What should it be? We're going to have to deal with this issue of a redistribution. In budget talks in Ottawa, we talk about reallocation. We have to talk about reallocating resources and power. We have to redefine sustainable development, so it's no longer us that are defining those terms. The people in this room are not necessarily the solution to these problems. The problems will be solved largely by the people who are suffering from those problems, and that's what we have to deal with. At the same time, while we are reducing differences, we want to celebrate diversity. At the same time, while I was thinking of all this, the wonderful friends at Think Upstream. Is anybody here from Upstream? I don't think Ryan's here, is he? But these are wonderful folks that had this meeting in April. And what they did was came up with their health equity action lens. And if point number 1 represents what I'm talking about here, then they're way ahead of the game. That's what we're talking about, is understanding the distribution of social determinants of health around an optimum and understanding what needs to be done to improve it. So my appeal is to repeat and repeat. I owe some thanks, certainly to a lot of people. There is a caveat, however, and I want to present you with that caveat, and it's something I present to all my students all the time. I could be wrong. Thanks very much.